Hi, my name is Ethan Hine. I'm a doctoral fellow in music education at New York University, which is where I'm talking to you from. I also teach music technology and music education here at NYU, at Montclair State University, and starting in the fall at the New School as well. And I'm here to talk to you today about hip hop in music education, the role that it plays, which right now is not much, the role that it could play, what some of the opportunities it presents are, and also what are some of the obstacles to adopting it in classrooms. So before I get into any of that, I want to explain a little bit about who I am as a musician and my relationship to this music. So, like hip hop, I was born in the Bronx in the mid 1970s. I grew up in New York City, and rap was just all around, right? It was just kind of the background music of New York City at that time, as it still is. And when I was growing up, I heard a lot of Run DMC and stuff like that, and I always kind of liked it in a passive way, but never really took it very seriously. Didn't know a lot about it. In my teenage years, when I started learning how to play instruments, guitar and harmonica and things like that, I started to develop this idea that hip hop was not real music, that it was just pushing buttons, just these canned loops, that rap, was kind of interesting, but it's not singing, right? It's not a real form of music necessarily. It's more like just kind of talking. There are a lot of musicians I know who have this same attitude. It's a really widespread belief among real musicians, not just classical musicians either. I got a lot of this attitude from rock musicians and from jazz musicians, and it took me many, many years to disabuse myself of this set of ideas. And I think it's a really pathological set of ideas. In my adulthood, having spent a lot more time listening to the music analytically, getting to know some people who make the music, getting to know more about the culture that produce the music, I'm coming to regard hip hop as the most significant cultural development of my lifetime, the most exciting creative development, certainly in popular music, but really just in music generally as an art form. And I'm not native to the music. Like, I'm a fan. I like it a lot. I listen to it. I'm a white guy. I'm not a rapper. I've done some producing in the hip hop idiom, but I'm not a natural at it. So I feel very much like an outsider to this culture. And I hope that listening to me talk about it will motivate you to seek out some people who are inside the culture and to not really take my word for anything. So a quick bit of definition, though, before we keep going. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between rap and hip hop, because the two terms are often used interchangeably, but they aren't exactly the same thing. So rap is a music genre, right? The most popular music genre in the United States, and at least among Spotify listeners, actually the most popular form of music in the world. Hip hop is a culture. It's a culture that produced this music called rap. But hip hop produced many other art forms as well. So, for example, there's hip hop dance, breakdancing being a famous version of hip hop dance, but not the only one. There's visual art that comes from hip hop, right? Graffiti, street art, hip hop fashion, street style. But hip hop, it's also a philosophy, it's a politics, it's a language, it's all of these things. Rap, by the way, is not the only music to come out of hip-hop. Turntablism, DJ scratching, it's a virtuoso instrumental art form. And you can think of modern R&B as being a hip-hop genre as well. So I think rap as a music is really important and really interesting. But I'm actually more interested in hip-hop, in the culture and value system of hip-hop. So let's talk a little bit about what that culture and value system is. So hip-hop, as an ethos, it's really a way of viewing yourself as a creative person in the world. It's a rule set. It's a set of norms and values. And one of the rules in that rule set is keeping it real. It's really important in hip hop to be authentic, to be truthful to yourself, to speak your own truth. It's interesting to me that rappers almost never cover each other's songs. It happens occasionally, but it's extremely unusual. There are ghostwriters employed by rappers, but it's considered to be a shameful practice. You're really supposed to write your own lyrics, and they're supposed to speak to your reality. Now, very often rappers are playing characters. They're playing kind of exaggerated versions of themselves, but even so, that character is still supposed to be rooted in your reality, right? Now, you might have heard, well, but what about sampling, right? It seems like rap is substantially built on appropriating other people's ideas. So that is true. Sampling is one of the foundational kind of aesthetic tenets of hip hop, right? But the idea with sampling is that you're not just taking an entire existing song and calling it your own. You're taking a piece of another song and you're looping it. And looping is a really important aesthetic gesture because it changes the nature of the material that you're looping. Not only are you hearing something repeated that you originally were only supposed to hear once, but you're also juxtaposing the end of the sample with the beginning of it. You're creating a new relationship, a new musical relationship that wasn't there in the original recording. And sampling is also about exclusion of material. You're going into whatever record you're sampling and you're saying, yeah, there's all this music in there, but I'm really only interested in this one bar or these two bars or this one little horn squeal or this one snare drum hit. And everything else I'm excluding, right? Sampling is really important. It's not just a pragmatic way of bringing sounds into your music that would be difficult to bring in there through the recording of live instruments, right? And, I mean, it is that. Sampling is very expedient. But what it really is a way of speaking back to your record collection or your iTunes library. And the central fact of being a musician, in this day and age is that you're competing with recorded music, right? For most people, recorded music is music. And when I was doing a lot of playing in bands, I found that fact to be intensely demoralizing. I had a funk band, like a funk R&B band, and pretty much everybody on earth would rather listen to a recording of Earth, Wind, and Fire than hear my funk band play an Earth, Wind, and Fire song. Pretty much including me, frankly. And I found that to be very depressing when I was playing. But eventually I had to make my peace with it. I had to say, live music and recorded music are not the same art form. There's a lot you can do in a recording studio that you can't do on a stage. And it's not just about getting perfect performances. It's about the sonic textural qualities of recorded sound. There's all of the compression and EQ and reverb and other kinds of effects that you can do with recorded audio. It's not just about the notes that the musicians are playing or singing. It's also about the microphones and the preamps and the tape stock and all of that, all those other sonic intangibles. So it's not just that we played Earth, Wind, and Fire songs worse than Earth, Wind, and Fire, although we did, but it was more that the timbre was missing, right? The sound of those drums, the sound of those vocals, the sound of Maurice White overdubbed on himself. Can't do that stuff with real singers. Sampling is a way of saying, hey, let's take the familiar timbre of that Earth, Wind, and Fire song and let's bring it into our song. Let's talk back to it. Let's participate in it. Let's add our own vocals to it. Let's even let's add some drum machines on there. Let's add our own synths. Let's add our own guitar. But let's have a two-way conversation with recorded music rather than just being passive consumers of it. That, I think, more than anything else, is the most important idea that hip-hop has contributed to the culture. And also electronic dance music, right, which also does a lot of sampling for a lot of the same reasons. But I feel like it's really hip-hop that has, that has built this entire aesthetic around the sample. So it's a contradiction, right? The idea that you can speak your own truth most clearly by sampling an existing recording. But it's true. It's a way of saying, I have a relationship to this recording, and I'm betting that you, the listener, have a relationship to it too. And even if you can't identify exactly where this snare drum is coming from, this snare drum has a timbre to it, has a particular sound that evokes something in you, even if it's completely unconscious. So for myself, the ability to give myself permission to go in there with music that I love, to go in with the Beatles or Duke Ellington or other people who I admire, and start having a musical conversation with them, has just been unbelievably liberating. I would really recommend it. So yeah, there's this contradiction where you're kind of scavenging existing material from the culture, but you're also speaking your own truths. So those are, I would say, like two of the really relevant tenets of hip hop for me. And from an aesthetic perspective, hip hop is an electronic music. It's a produced music. It's a recorded music. There are live instrumentalists who do it. There's the Roots, Amir Questlove Thompson, one of the great drummers of our time. But their playing is very heavily influenced by sampling and by MIDI and sequencing. Questlove's drumming is very much influenced by the sound of samples and drum machines. And the Roots are outliers. For the most part, hip-hop is being produced entirely with computers, with synthesizers, with samples, with turntables, and it really doesn't exist independently of recorded media, right? Rap, the vocal element of it, is very substantially improvised. Some people are writing their raps in advance, but a lot of people are just rhyming off the top of their head in the recording studio. And it's the ability to take improvisation and edit it to give it a shape, to take ad libs, but then to like clean them up and give them more kind of intentionality. That's really the characteristic sound of hip hop. The idea that you can have spontaneity and looseness, but you can also use the computer to line things up perfectly on the grid and have everything be like rhythmically exact and timbrally very specific and precise. So it's it's a really liberatory art form, because the idea is that you work fast in the studio. You don't spend a lot of time. You try to get it right the first time, but that you can use things like quantization and EQ and compression to make stuff sound really optimal and really perfect after you've recorded it. If you come from a live instrument background, the recording centrism of hip-hop is a big challenge. It certainly was for me. For me, the entry point was more turntablism, which, like I said, it's a virtuoso instrumental art form. You're scratching turntables live. And it's something that people do in recordings too, but it's very much like a performance art form, more than other areas of hip-hop as a music. But I did eventually come to see recorded music as a beautiful art form unto itself, and one whose creativities are very different from the demands of playing an instrument live in real time on a stage. So what does this mean for music teachers? What can hip hop as an aesthetic and as a value system do for you? So for me, what it does is it encourages me to think of the recording, right, as the ultimate purpose of musical creativity, as the ultimate output. The performance, it's important, but it's not as important. And that if we're thinking of the studio, the recording studio, as the main venue of creativity, that the processes by which we're being creative can be very loose, can be very improvisational, can be exploratory, because we can use the computer to impose whatever degree of sonic perfection we want after the fact. The idea that everything is on the table, that live instrumental performances are certainly available, but also pre-existing samples and loops. And it might be the royalty-free loops that come with GarageBand or whatever program you're using, or loops that you're getting off the web, loops that you're getting from sample compilations, or it might be samples of copyrighted stuff. And there we get into some legal territory, and I'll get into it. That's a sort of complicated thing. But from a creative perspective, it's all pretty equal, right? And that we can also use MIDI, right? We can play stuff in on the piano keyboard or on the computer keyboard. We can draw stuff in with the mouse. We can really just whatever, right? Anything goes. Anything is on the table as long as it sounds good. And that the content of this music should speak to students' own reality, that the students should really be speaking in the first person about their own experience. That it's not necessary to first recreate existing rap songs. It's not necessary to learn to rap other people's lyrics. It's a good idea. It's a good learning exercise, but it's not a prerequisite to being creative. And this shows a little bit of this aligns with my background as a rock musician. So in rock guitar, right, you learn 3 chords and then you just start writing songs immediately. It's not necessary to learn other people's songs before you start writing your own. It's a good idea to learn other people's songs for sure. It definitely helps you, but it's not necessary. And there are some rock musicians who just never do it. For them, just writing is the whole purpose of learning to play the instrument in the first place. So you can really approach hip hop the same way, that just creating stuff by trial and error is a perfectly valid way of approaching the music. Now, this ethos of speaking in the first person also helps us address one of the major challenges of bringing rap into your classroom, which is language, right? Commercial rap, which doesn't represent the entire art form, but certainly is the most visible form of it, it uses a lot of bad language. And there's a long history in the African-American vernacular tradition of using profane and irreverent language, and not always for shock value, sometimes for comedy value, but it's a fact and definitely a challenge for classroom teachers. So if your focus is on kids creating their own music rather than trying to bring in stuff that's on the radio, you can just make a rule, no profanity. And some of the kids might chafe against that rule, but, like I like to say, look, you can curse all you want when you're, doing stuff in your bedroom, but here in school, we got to have rules, and one of the rules is no profanity. I certainly don't mind the use of curse words, but I don't like misogynistic language. I don't like calling women bitches, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable rule to say, hey, if you're working with me, I don't like misogynistic language. When you're on your own without me, say whatever you want. So another really core value in hip hop is freshness, right? Is being current. And that doesn't mean embracing novelty for the sake of novelty, but it definitely means keeping your finger on the pulse, just knowing what's going on out there. And music education is a, pretty traditional kind of profession for the most part, right? I mean, things like marching bands and choirs and orchestras are, they're much more a fact of America's musical past than of its present. And the idea that we should be, chasing pop culture and having to constantly rethink the repertoire and, rethink the references, it's a challenge. It's certainly a challenge for me. I'm 43 years old. I, don't keep my ear glued to the radio as much as I might have 20 years ago. But I view it as an obligation to just keep current, to be able to speak the kids' language, to, at least know and have some appreciation for the musical world that they inhabit. And it's not all painful. Some of the stuff that is on the radio is extremely cool. And my interest is much more on the production side than on the lyrical side. But, there's a lot going on the lyrical side as well. Thanks to my desire to keep it fresh, I found out about Chance the Rapper, who is amazing, a genius. Kendrick Lamar, tremendous. But even Migos, right? I mean, their stuff is maybe a little bit less profound and poetic than Kendrick or Chance the Rapper, but those guys are funny and they're real creative vocalists, and they really have expanded my idea about like what vocal sounds you can use in a pop song. So yeah, freshness is really important, and it ties directly into keeping it real, right? That it's fine to try to broaden kids' horizons, but you got to build trust with them first, and the way that you build trust is to start where they live, right? So another core hip-hop value, by the way, these hip-hop values that I'm listing, if you're interested in learning more about these ideas, It's from an article by Adam Cruz called Being Hiphop. Maybe there'll be a link in the description or somewhere around this video, but Adam Cruz, Kruse, Being Hiphop. Another one of the values that Adam Cruz lists in Being Hiphop is making some noise, meaning participating, right? Hip-hop is a participatory art form. I'm working in this after-school program in a middle school in Harlem right now, and 100% of the kids can rap. They don't all enjoy doing it as much as each other, and some of them are better at it than others, but it's a thing that they can just all do, and it's a pretty common way for them to pass the time in the playground or in the cafeteria. The idea is that you participate, right? And, if someone else is performing, you participate by going, yeah, you shout encouragement, you give reactions, you make your feelings known, you dance, you nod your head. Maybe you're not literally participating with your voice, but you are participating. And in hip hop, there is the idea of the cipher, right? The circle of MCs where everybody takes turns freestyling and everybody in the circle participates. There's no audience. There's only the people who are doing it, who are making the music. So I'm coming from other kinds of participatory cultures. So rock was at one time a participatory culture. And now it's sort of turning into more of a presentational one. When you go to one of these giant rock concerts, audience participation is a thing, but it's not the main thing. But I also come from jazz, which is very much a participatory art form. There's the jam session tradition, right? And blues, very much a participatory art form. So certainly there are, professional rappers and professional performers, but there isn't this giant wall of separation between them, the artists, and us, the normal people. The idea is that really anybody can step up to the mic and do this. Anybody can get a copy of FL Studio and do this. There are going to be people who are better at it. There are going to be people who are more enthusiastic about it, for sure. But this is the thing that you can do. And to me, this is the biggest conceptual contribution that hip-hop can make to music education. The idea that this is not just for the talented people. This is not just for the special people. This is not just for the people who are going to devote their entire existence to it. That it's a thing that can just be a venue for, amateur music participation, which if there, one of America's big problems is we are not doing a lot of amateur music participation. And I think it shows in our really high unhappiness levels. You would not think that the wealthiest society in the history of the world would be so unhappy, but we are. And the whole point of music education historically was to prepare people for amateur music participation, right? The reason that we have marching bands in schools is that marching bands used to just be a ubiquitous feature of civic life in America. Every town had a marching band. Every Rotary Club, every fire department had a marching band. Choral singing used to be a lot more common than it is now. I mean, it's still common, I guess, if you're an active churchgoer, but if you aren't, there's not a lot of opportunities to do choral singing. Certainly, there's not a lot of opportunities to play orchestral music, right? There are community orchestras, but it's hard as an adult to find opportunities to play your French horn or to play your cello. So I do believe very strongly that a goal of music education should continue to be preparing people for a lifetime of amateur music participation. And if there aren't opportunities to participate in choirs or marching bands or orchestras, we got to have some other things on the menu. So the move towards teaching guitar and ukulele and bucket drumming, I think those are all really positive developments. Certainly, there are plenty of opportunities in this world to play the ukulele or play the guitar, but it's not enough, right? It's not enough. We live in a world where, at this point, pretty close to 100% of Americans have access to a smartphone, which means that 100% of Americans have access to a pretty full-figured electronic music production studio. Using just the apps on a smartphone, it is possible to make incredibly good-sounding beats, synths, samples. You can plug a microphone in there and do quite good sounding recordings. Pretty significant recent development. Kendrick Lamar's album Damn has a song on it that was produced by Steve Lacy using nothing but a guitar and his iPhone. He plugged in his guitar using this thing called an iRig and recorded it into the mobile version of GarageBand and did beats and mixing and editing all there in his phone. That track ended up on this Kendrick Lamar album, and that album won the Pulitzer Prize. That's a pretty significant development, right? So not only is it possible to, use phones, tablets, computers to make music in an amateur way, but it's possible to make it in a way that actually sounds remarkably good. Not saying that everyone is going to be on a Kendrick Lamar level, but it is certainly possible to make stuff that sounds good and that gives you a feeling of satisfaction. It's a really remarkable opportunity. But to take advantage of that opportunity, we've got to learn to embrace the musical forms that are most native to digital audio production and synthesis. And as a practical matter, that means hip hop, techno, other kinds of electronic music. And to me, this is no big sacrifice. I love electronic music. I've learned to really appreciate the precision and the specificity that it makes possible. That you have, like literally infinite varieties of timbres to work with. That it's possible to turn any sound into a drum, that it's possible to sample any sound, loop it, and make it into a melodic instrument. It's a really exciting time. The fact that it's possible to do these things on the bus, on the subway, sitting on a park bench, wherever you happen to be, is a pretty remarkable opportunity. The fact that you can use the internet to, you can post stuff on SoundCloud or on YouTube or, a million other places, and people around the world can instantly hear it. That is a pretty remarkable development. And I think that if we're not helping students take advantage of these opportunities, we're not really doing our jobs. So I have heard, various kinds of pushback to this idea that we should be embracing hip-hop creativities in the music classroom, one of which is, so if kids can do this in their bedroom, and if it's music that they're hearing all the time anyway, why do we need to do it in the classroom? Why don't we use the classroom to do stuff that kids can't do in their free time? So the answer to that is, it's one thing to be able to do something, but it's another thing to go ahead and actually do it, right? I taught myself digital audio production in my literal bedroom, but it took me a long time, and it took a lot of effort. And I was highly driven to the point of obsession, so I was willing to, just put in the hours and kind of bang my head against it. And the people who are, out there producing rap, from their bedrooms are similarly, driven and probably usually pretty obsessive. But I think there's a much larger number of kids who aren't that driven or obsessive, but who, if given a little bit of a push or if given an opportunity, if given some encouragement, would get a lot of value out of it. They just might not seek it out so intentionally on their own. Also, it's a lot of trial and error figuring stuff out on your own. It takes a long time. It took me years to figure out how to, get a decent sounding drum pattern programmed into a drum machine. It took me years to find out what an 808 is and why you should use one. And I didn't give up, but a lot of people do give up in the face of so much trial and error. So as music educators, we have an opportunity to just save kids a lot of banging their head against the wall. That, we can say, oh, hey, would you want that bass line that you're trying to program to sound better, rather than, trying every chromatic pitch one at a time by trial and error. There's this thing called the Phrygian mode, and if you're trying to make trap music, you should really play in the Phrygian mode, play the white keys, but treat E as your bass note. Stuff is going to start sounding the way you want it to sound, right? We can really save the kids a lot of tedious and frustrating effort that way. So, yeah, that's my spiel. I am available on the web. I've got a website, ethanhine.com. It's a blog. You can read my dissertation where I talk about all of these things in much heavier and more academic terms with a lot of citations. And there's also a lot of more casual writing on there. You can hear music that I'm producing. I'm active on all the social media. You can find me on the blog sidebar there. And I want to thank you very much for listening. I'll see you guys on the web.